welcome to Beyond Biotech, the weekly podcast from Labiotech. I'm Dylan Kassane, and this is episode 181 for the podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to have Tim Opler, a leading voice in biotech investment banking, here on the show. Tim's career spans academia, Credit Suisse, and co-founding Toroya Partners, which Stifel acquired in 2023. Today, as Managing Director in Stifel's Global Healthcare Group, he's advised on over 150 deals totaling more than $100 billion, shaping major M&A, licensing, and financing in the life sciences. Tim is renowned for his insightful Biopharma Market Updates, and in this episode, we'll dive into his December 2025 edition, where he outlines 5 transformative trends set to drive biopharma for the next decade. M&A booms, giant markets, China's rising innovation, AI's reshaping of healthcare, and incredible scientific advances. I hope you enjoy my sit-down with Tim Opler. Tim, welcome to Beyond Biotech.
Thank you, Dylan. It's great to be with you, and I really appreciate everyone listening to this to take the time.
Tim, a lot of people listening might have heard of you before, they might have read some of your analysis, but for people who don't know you so well, can you start by just introducing yourself and tell us how you got started in this investing and biotech industry?
Yeah, so I have a PhD in economics. I became a professor of business and finance. One day, someone rather surprisingly read one of my research papers, and before I knew it, I was working for Merrill Lynch. That was in 1994, so 32 years ago. And I really liked the investment banking industry, and that's because for me, every day was kind of a new case study, so it's quite interesting intellectually. Eventually, I ended up in the healthcare sector, focused largely on the biopharma side. So that started really in 2001. Today, I work for Stifel as a managing director focused on the biopharmaceutical space. Being kind of that economist type, I do like to opine about the industry, and I'm really passionate about the pharmaceutical industry. So I do write a report from time to time that has gained some readership, which you mentioned.
How did you actually fall into biotech then? What was it that attracted you just to the field of pharma in the first place?
It's a great question. So one of my big clients back, say, around 1999, 2000 was Microsoft. And one day, the treasurer of Microsoft said, "I'd like you to meet the treasurer of Pfizer." At the time, by the way, Microsoft and Pfizer had more or less the same market cap. Today, it's vastly different. Microsoft has become, one of the world's largest companies. And so, I went to meet Pfizer. I don't want to say annoyed, but certainly not focused on the pharma industry at all. Just like, okay, what are you guys doing? How can I be helpful? And then, I just slowly fell in love with the industry.
Now, you're managing director today. What does that actually mean in terms of day-to-day work? What are you doing? What are you watching? What are you managing?
I'm an investment banker that is focused on M&A activity in the biopharmaceutical industry. So my clients tend to either be small emerging companies that are on the sell side or large companies that are on the buy side. So I will represent larger companies that are looking to add assets to their portfolio, or alternatively, smaller companies that are looking to be bought, or much more often have received some type of overture from one of those large companies. Essentially, a banker is a fancy word for broker.
Now, you mentioned, and I know you as well from the Biopharma Market Updates. These come out pretty regularly, but maybe you can explain what these reports are, how often you release them, and why did you start creating them in the first place?
Yeah, it all goes back to the pandemic. So, the life of a banker is seeing clients in person. And I was just very distraught and sort of shocked when the pandemic hit. I mean, in a way, it was nice to be at home, continually for a year or two. But I was used to going out to see clients, and I wanted that connectivity that I had with clients. And I said to myself, well, why don't I just write something and send it out? So the first time I sent it out, I went out to, say, 30 of my clients. They started sending it to other people. And all of a sudden, that product started to grow. And so today it's taken on a life of its own. Those updates go out to many thousands of readers in our industry.
The updates, they cover a big range of topics. It's everything from really big trends to sometimes some really specific market data as well. What sort of things get your interest? What do you decide to include in each one, or does it vary?
I'm fundamentally fascinated and interested in the fact that the pharmaceutical industry is just constantly changing and evolving. So people will say, oh, well, there's big pharma, as if, it's like these car companies have been there for 100 years. If you look at the composition of big pharma, it's completely different every 20 years for the last 100 years. And so the industry is one of the most contestable industries. And the idea that, you can sit in a laboratory and concoct some chemical and then people will take it in mass is kind of a interesting and almost bizarre idea. So I spent a lot of time talking about how the industry is going to change.
Okay. And in our December edition, the December edition you put out, you actually highlighted 5 trends in there that are going to drive the change looking forward into the next 10 years. It's these I wanted to dive into a little bit with you today. And the
Yep,
first trend
yep.
you highlighted there was M&A. That's pretty broad.
Yeah, so one of the oddities of the pharmaceutical industry is that companies are dependent on the patents associated with these chemicals that you devise in the lab. And so as a result, patents have actually rather short lives, so 20-year lives, completely different than saying being in like Amazon's business or Microsoft's business, where I got started. And so as a result, the pharma companies have to be constantly coming up with new chemical entities. That's hard to do. And so that leads to a natural desire and interest in actually just going out and acquiring them, which we call M&A. So last year, M&A took off, sort of starting, I would say, in July, August, and it's been strong ever since. So in my December report, I talk about the fact that we do expect to see a lot of M&A continuing in the year ahead, including this year, 2026.
You mentioned in the report there that something like 40% of big pharma revenue is at risk right now for these patent expirations by 2030. Why do pharma companies struggle to replace these drugs internally and so have to go out and acquire new companies?
It's a great question. And, large organizations have to have large budgets and large bureaucracies. And, somehow that tends to squash innovation. And so you see, multiple companies. So think Novartis, J&J, Pfizer, they have $10 billion plus R&D budgets, and yet the productivity from those organizations has been disappointing. So it's just very hard to say, hey, Dylan, or hey, Tim, why don't you come up with 3 molecules for me, in 5 years? Here's the money, just go off and do it. It's innovation is different. It comes from flashes of insight. It's hard to do on command.
Now, these top pharma companies, you write, have something like 1.2 trillion in M&A firepower ready. What limits their ability to use it fully? Why aren't they going to use it all?
It's a great question. So, as a banker who's worked with these large companies for years, it's one thing to say, okay, there's all this firepower. And yet year after year, you see all these reports, not just from people like me, but from, PwC, like here's this massive firepower. And then you look at the actual M&A volume that happened in a given year, and it's never quite what people think it might have been. And so the question is why? And the answer is actually very simple, which is there's other uses for that cash. And so one of the most important uses of cash in a company is rainy day money. In other words, what if next year there's a disaster that strikes? And it happens all the time in our industry. You need to have that cash to essentially protect the business in a downturn type scenario. And so companies have learned to keep strong balance sheets. And as a result, no one is actually going to go out and use up their entire balance sheet unless there's just some incredibly pressing reason to do so.
You said we're seeing somewhat of a rise in M&A, especially in the second half of 2025. It's tracking to be a pretty strong year there, in fact. How do you expect it to evolve, though, over the next decade with the influence of these patent expirations and some of the hot areas that you're tracking as well?
I spoke yesterday to a senior executive at one of the larger pharma companies and had this very conversation and asked him the question you're asking me. And he said, look, my senior management is making it incredibly clear that we need to go acquire assets. And Tim, they need to be late stage assets. We're not interested in early pipeline. And so, there's just a finite set of assets that actually check the boxes for that company. And as a result, they've just got to get it done. Otherwise, they're going to end up having to downsize the entire organization, which is not something an executive wants to do.
So that's M&A. That's trend number one. Trend number two is these giant markets. Now, you forecast that real pharma spending in the US is going to at least double over the next 35 years due to increasing wealth. What data actually supports this?
So historically, if you go back 100 years, what you'll see, at least in the US data, is that the level of real GDP, the actual production of real stuff has gone up 20 times. But the consumption of pharmaceutical products has gone up 100 times in real terms. If you will, 100 years ago, there really was almost no such thing as the pharmaceutical industry. Basically, as people become wealthier, they satisfy their basic needs for food, needs for transportation, needs for housing. And then the question becomes what's next. And so you might have the choice in your own life, Dylan, of let's say, got this extra money, I could go on holiday, I could buy myself a nice motorcycle or a boat, or I could work on becoming more healthy. And so in practice, people prioritize health quite a bit. And it's the reason that economists say that pharmaceutical products are a superior good, or sometimes they'll use the phrase luxury good. And what that means is the income elasticity of demand is greater than one. And so the effect of that is, the world is becoming a wealthier place. And so the proportion of income that's being spent on pharmaceuticals is rising all the time. And as a result, there's just a lot more budget for people to consume pharmaceuticals. And that's why I predict we're going to see ever larger markets.
You note that pharmaceuticals now make up 3.5% of total personal consumption expenditures in the US. What factors have driven this? Is it just becoming more wealthy, or is it people living longer and spending more in their later years?
I think it's a very good question. So, two things are happening. First of all, pharmaceuticals are getting better. So, like, if you went back 100 years, like, there weren't very many good pharmaceuticals. We had aspirin, for example, back then, but there wasn't much. Today, pharmaceuticals are abundant and very purposeful, and they can do lots of things. And so people just have a lot more to buy. Pharmaceuticals can change your life, and whether you're suffering from pain or obesity, or whether you have cancer or lung disease, and none of that was available before. So that's one factor driving demand. But the big factor driving demand is that we're just living longer. So, let's be blunt. The longer you live, the more things go wrong. I mean, how many people have you met in your life that like, well, I had cancer 4 times? Like that's kind of crazy. Like you didn't hear that 50 years ago. And like, well, you got cancer, you got rid of it, you got cancer again, then you got, this and that. And so every time you get one of those diseases, of course, you need pharmaceuticals.
One of the other things about these giant markets that you note is a shift from specialty drugs to mass market drugs, drugs that are going to appeal to the consumer there, with obesity drugs noted potentially reaching 200 billion in sales. How are things like consumer pull, out-of-pocket spending, direct-to-consumer platforms, how are they going to change the game?
Right. So two very good questions and thoughts there. So the first is if you do go back and look, say 30 years ago, like that was just the time when we were starting to see the first so-called blockbuster billion-dollar drug. The first blockbuster was a drug for, gastrointestinal upset. And of course, that's something we all worry about and care about, but it wasn't exactly, lung cancer. And then what started to happen is that as again, people had more wealth, some of these drugs started to get a lot bigger and a lot better. And so the kind of the big event in our industry was Lipitor. Lipitor was the first drug to go over 10 billion. But if you go back and look at how Lipitor was priced, it was roughly $600 a year. And so actually not that much. And so you had to sell a lot of Lipitor to sell $10 billion worth. Um, what then started to happen is we shifted to this new model that was pioneered by Genzyme, which is the specialty pricing model. In other words, sell a lot less drug, but at a much higher price. In other words, as our colleague in the industry, Clive Meanwell, likes to say, we went from selling Volkswagen Bugs to selling Lamborghinis, and so drugs became a lot more expensive. What's happened now that is just so remarkable and really caught my attention is that both Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly were charging $12,000 a year, at least list price, for their GLP-1 drugs. But they recently cut a deal with the US government that's locked in a price of $4,000 a year. And now anyone who wants the stuff in Medicare and Medicaid can get it, which is like 40 million people in the US. So what I like to say is we're now going to mass markets with medium prices. So $4,000 a year is a bloody good price for a pharmaceutical product. It's six times, more than six times what Pfizer was getting for Lipitor. And so the reason I'm so excited about the industry's future is that governments have essentially signed off on mass market drugs at much higher prices than we had ever allowed before.
You know, the ultimate giant market that you mentioned in the report there is aging drugs, something that's potentially worth $1 trillion moving forward. Is this just so promising because we've hit that nice level where people are living longer and they're also wealthier in Europe and in the United States?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's not controversial that if, you could take a pill that would cause you to live 20 years longer, people would pay a lot for that. The question is that even possible? And what I argued in a recent report I wrote on the topic of aging is that the science is getting there. So if you look at aging science, it's really quite good. In other words, before we come up with new drugs for migraine or GERD or whatever, you actually have to understand what's the cause of this. In other words, it is interesting that we all sort of die on a schedule. Like nobody lives to 150. Like there are no survivors in humanity past like age 125. So like the question is why? And to me, that's just another science question. And well, we know the answer to that question pretty well at this point, and which means you can actually drug that. You can alter the underlying biological causes, like you could alter the cause of having high cholesterol.
We've got two trends down. Trend number 3 is China innovation. Tell me, China is nothing like what it was when you got started investing and looking into biotech.
Yeah, I mean, so China, 15 years ago was a company of generics. And actually, like, if you ask the typical Western executive, what do you think of China? You would hear the most nasty things. Their generics aren't even generics. Like when you test them, they're not even bioequivalent. Oh, and by the way, you can't trust them at all in business. They're going to steal patents. Like people view China as like the low of the low. The Chinese government started to change all that. And so there were policies that promoted patenting. There were policies that were promoting innovation. And that was all fine. Then the pandemic hit. And what happened in the pandemic, and most people, when you ask them about China, they're either neutral or vaguely anti-China. But I tend to be kind of pro-China. And the reason is I'm very sympathetic with the situation that they faced. The Chinese government basically said to Moderna and Pfizer, like, hey, we could really use some COVID vaccines. And you know what they said? They said, no, you can't have them. So they ended up having to do homegrown vaccines that weren't very good. And so here's this gigantic country of 1.3 billion people that had rather crap, COVID vaccines. And you can imagine that the Chinese government said, this will never happen again. Never again. And so at that point, they started pouring billions of dollars into biopharmaceutical innovation. And all of a sudden, like last year, 2025, we woke up and said, what the hell? Like China's gotten really good. Well, like no surprise, right? They had no choice but to invest in that industry. And so China's become a formidable competitor in biopharmaceutical innovation.
It's not only the quality of the innovation, though, it's the speed, though. We're talking about twice as fast, 5 times as fast when it comes to clinical development.
Yeah, China does a lot right. If you go to the country, you'll see, they're not going to most likely be the first to come up with like the electric car. Tesla had to really get the electric car right. But now there's 20 companies that have a car that's better than Tesla. So they're able to take an innovative idea from elsewhere and then iterate on it. And they can do so in a much quicker way. And the pharma industry is no exception.
Big pharma is starting to look at China as a place where they can license molecules as well. Funding sources are starting to diversify in China too. How is this impacting global competition, which for so long was just US, Europe, and somewhere else?
I mean, one of the fascinating things is how come we haven't seen a Chinese big pharma? So, the biggest Chinese pharma today is probably Hengrui, 40, $50 billion market cap, but why isn't 10 times larger? One of the fascinating things is that the senior leadership of most of these large companies are actually in the People's Congress. At least the CEO of Hengrui is. And his wife was the one who founded Hanso, another very large company. She's also in the People's Congress. So this is essentially the Communist Party's capitalist infrastructure, sort of a weird concept in a way. They have a simple goal, which is to take care of the people of China. The Chinese government's goal is not to take care of the people of the world. That's not their objective. Their objective is to stay in power. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure your people are healthy. And so that's how they think. Um, so that's created an enormous opportunity as they come up with great molecules for pharma to come out and pick up those molecules. I personally think that the number one threat to large pharma today is China. Most people say the number one threat to biotech is China. I see China as an opportunity for biotech, but a threat to big pharma. And the reason is that if these pharma companies are spending $10 billion plus on R&D, and Chinese company for let's say 1/20th of the budget can come up with a portfolio that's just as good, that means that there's something fundamentally wrong with that pharma business model.
So, what's the challenge to China then? Is it data privacy? Is it regulation? Is it just a government that's not interested in becoming a world leader?
Yeah, right. I mean, China is not, despite what you might hear political overtones, China is fundamentally a country that's playing defense. So when you see like China the other day, I guess they were in Venezuela, like the moment, we parachuted in to snatch the Venezuelan leader. Like, are they actually trying to take over Venezuela? No, they're trying to get the resources of Venezuela to take care of their people back in China. So their entire strategy, whether it involves rare earths or getting access to beef or getting access to oil, is very much focused on taking care of the 1.3 billion people they have at home.
So, from China to trend four, AI reshaping healthcare. Uh, you had a really nice comparison in the update there, which was comparing AI's impact to how SatNav or GPS just made the knowledge of a taxi driver in London almost obsolete. Can you talk a little bit about that? Explain what you meant.
Yeah. So AI involves using, these days at least, neural networks to essentially parse through very large data sets and come up with insights. And it's shockingly good. Like when people that use ChatGPT and now things like Google Gemini have gotten really good, like it's just so amazingly good. And so everyone's sort of saying, okay, how does this work and what's it good at? So what I like to say is, AI can, or the computer can easily beat me in chess. And that's because the number of moves that one might be able to play in chess is quite large, far larger than my head can handle, but not far larger than the computer can handle. So that's a medium dimensional problem. In contrast, designing a molecule from scratch to go after a hard problem in biology is a high dimensional problem. And so AI has not been able to come up with new molecules. But it turns out that AI can like navigate around London as much just as well as a taxi driver that's been trained forever. And the reason it can do that is that the number of streets in London, while there are a lot of them, pose a medium dimensional problem. The point that I was trying to make in that report was that being a doctor is very complicated. It's a lot like being a cab driver in London. It takes years of training to learn to be a good doctor. And if you talk to doctors, they'll give you long speeches about you have to look at the patient in the eye. You have a feeling around when you're around the patient, all these sorts of things. There's a lot of implicit knowledge involved in being a doctor. Um, well, the computer, in my opinion, can chew through that just as easily as the computer can chew through the streets of London. And so what's going to happen in healthcare, and it's already happening, is people will just start using AI to solve their medical problems. I don't know if you've tried it, Dylan, or if you have friends that, but like the other day, I had like this really bad feeling in my foot. It looks like my left side of my foot was bruised, but I looked at it, there was no bruise there. So I just sat down, ChatGPT. I'm walking, I have this bruised feeling in my foot. And it immediately said, oh, yes, yes, that's such and such ligament. And what's happened to that ligament is that you stretched it and you probably wore a pair of shoes that didn't have the right, type of heel. And this is what you need to do. I did that, problem solved. So, ordinarily I would have gone off to see the podiatrist. And what you're starting to see is that utilization of medical services has dropped rather dramatically.
Yeah, I was thinking about how this is going to impact physicians who I know a few who are already frustrated by people who come in and say, well, I Googled this or I went to WebMD and I already know what's wrong with me. I just want the prescription. This is almost taking that to the next level and, cutting them out of the loop.
Most people in the US have used a large language model to self-diagnose in the last year at this point. I was in China recently. I was having dinner with a group of Chinese pharma executives, and I asked them the same question. I'm like, are you guys doing this? They laughed. They said, of course we're all doing it. They said, in the US, at least you have doctors. In China, you have to go to the hospital if something's wrong. So like, AI is dramatically changing the way China medicine's going to work. And I think it's the biggest thing that's going to happen in healthcare. And we're more focused. Your audience and my world is more focused on pharma. But the reason this change is so important of pharma is that everything about pharma is designed to go through doctors. Well, there may not be a lot of doctors left. You're the sales rep at Pfizer, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, who do I go see at OpenAI to actually talk to about how this computer program is recommending or not recommending our drugs?
Yeah, I think if I read your update correctly, you don't envisage the end of doctors, but mainly fewer physicians overseeing some of these AI systems. How is that going to impact healthcare when it comes to access and costs? I can see it being more open. Will it be cheaper?
It should be cheaper. It should be a lot cheaper. Who knows what will actually happen? I mean, the way I like to think of it is that most people that are sick, like if you're really sick, you're probably not in a good spot to whip out your iPhone and, you know, use ChatGPT for a quick session. It's different than me and my foot. And so I see someone showing up at your house that, let's say the person just got out of the army and he or she, they're responsible but not that knowledgeable. And they have a big iPad in their hand, and that iPad is tied into, some type of large language model. Um, they can say, okay, Dylan, tell me about this, tell me about that. All right. For you, you just need this GERD medication. But then they come see me. It's like, oh, Tim, you need to go see a specialist right away. And so I see AI becoming kind of the front line of medicine and fundamentally increasing the access at a much lower cost. I recently spoke to a friend of mine who lives in Hollywood, and we were just sort of chatting about this. And he's like, yeah, I agree. This is going to be the biggest thing that happens in medicine in the next decade. He said it's going to be unimaginably huge. And then he started like spouting off, like, here's another idea, here's another way of doing it. So I don't think we've actually begun to contemplate how business models are going to be designed that allow people to access AI when they're sick. But it in my opinion, is will be the biggest thing that happened in our sector in a very long time.
So that's AI. Your fifth trend is just amazing science, incredible science. You had a list there of so many of these really meaningful bioscience advances in 2025, curative cell therapies, aging drugs for animals, for dogs. Can you outline maybe a couple of the others that were just exciting for you and some of the implications that you see coming from those?
Yeah, I'll even start with a broader comment, and we can definitely get into kind of what's going on in specific areas of innovation. You know, I mentioned before that pharmaceutical companies are not that productive, right? So R&D productivity is actually quite low. Um, and yet, how can I be so optimistic about science? And so, for whatever reason, even though pharma companies struggle, science productivity, I think, is actually getting better. In the tech sector, people like to talk about this notion of scalability. And it's sort of a buzz phrase that, like, what the hell does this mean? What people really mean when they say this is highly scalable is it's sort of like making Microsoft Office. It's a lot of work to design Microsoft Office once, but once you have it, you can sell 10 copies, you can sell 10 million copies, you can sell 10 billion copies. Fundamentally, the marginal cost of producing extra copies is essentially just the cost of packaging. Similarly, people will often say, well, we're going to make pharma scalable. Well, that's just a joke, right? There's one thing I can say about this industry, having been involved in it now for, over 20 years, it's not very scalable. So innovations tend to be done by individuals. But it is my belief that the confluence of a lot more smart PhDs plus open access to science, especially the open science movement, anyone can learn science, plus AI, plus the ability of people to use so many more tools today has really democratized the invention of pharmaceutical products. And as a result, it is becoming a much more scalable industry. China is in the midst of proving that to us right now. And so when I look at, you know, why one might want to be optimistic about the industry, it's the fact that we're able to scale innovation more quickly in the future than we have in the past. It's a very big change. Um, what is my favorite area of science right now? I like simplicity. I don't like complexity. And, one of the simplest ideas and most profound ideas I've seen is cell therapy for Parkinson's. Parkinson's is caused by the lack of dopamine in the brain. If you don't have dopamine, all sorts of very bad things happen, these on episodes and off episodes. And what we are seeing now from at least 10 companies is dramatic improvements in Parkinson's. I actually think it should be the biggest story of 2026. For whatever reason, all the companies that are working on this stuff, like Aspen, they've released data on a few patients, like in a conference or whatever, but they haven't actually come out and said, we've cured the disease. The bottom line is that Parkinson's is measured by the UPDRS score. So if you have a UPDRS of 60, you're a disaster. If you have a UPDRS of 10, you're like you and me, you're in pretty good shape. Well, we're seeing UPDRS scores go from 60 to 10 routinely with cell therapy for Parkinson's. This is a large disease. So this is a very exciting moment for humanity to see what we've been able to do.
In this section of your report, you had a biosciences innovation importance pyramid with the different levels of the pyramid, from really incremental changes down to civilizational changes. Tell me how you came up with this and what does it mean?
Sometimes, a simple innovation can have massive implications. My favorite example of that is the birth control pill. Like everything about our society has been impacted by the birth control pill. The actual mechanics of the birth control pill are very simple. It's not fundamentally any different than cell therapy for Parkinson's. So you're essentially inhibiting ovulation through, very basic changes in how progesterone gets processed. And yet, you know, you give women the choice of not having babies, and guess what? There's a lot less babies being made these days. And so, some countries now, like Italy and Japan, they have like total fertility ratios that are well below replacement. And so, everything about Japan is being shaped by the birth control pill.
I looked at what fell into your civilizational changing area, and I was surprised it's a bit that's either very recent or emerging right now. So for sure the birth control pill was there, but that's also that's been around for a little while now. But gene therapy, mRNA vaccines, obesity drugs, precision medicine, AI, does that mean we're in a particularly special period now in pharma innovation?
Right. So, there's a famous quote from Isaac Newton saying, if I'm great, it's because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, let's just say there's just a lot more giant shoulders to stand on these days. So knowledge accumulation in biology is cumulative. Like you can't forget what you learned. And so there's just a lot more that we're learning. And the more we learn, the more shoulders we're creating for the next guy to come along. This is why it's so exciting to see the scalability of biopharmaceutical innovation.
And I guess as we're wrapping up, what sort of advice are you giving to biotech innovators, investors, as they're looking at all of these trends converging? Should they be excited? Should they be optimistic? Or should they be scared, worried about what's coming?
Look, I'm fundamentally optimistic and wildly optimistic about the industry. I think the the biggest change that we've touched on a lot of changes today, but the biggest change for the pharmaceutical industry is this notion that you can charge a medium price for a very large market. And the money is out there because of changing wealth. And so the demand that people will have to buy more pharmaceutical products in these big markets is going to absolutely transform this industry. When you look back at pharma at 2026, say 10 years from now or in 15 years from now, people will be saying, how quaint. It was such a small little industry. Like people didn't see just how big things will be. So like, to us, like Keytruda is this unimaginably large $30 billion product. That's going to be piffle, right? I mean, we're going to have much larger products in the future. And so, as an investor, as someone who's interested in, what can we do for patients? It's an incredibly exciting moment.
It's exciting times. Tim, thanks for joining us today on Beyond Biotech.
Dylan, thank you very much for having me. And again, for all of those of you listening, thank you for joining.
That's it for this episode. Don't forget to check out all the latest news and analysis at Labiotech.eu. I hope wherever you are in the world, you have a great week ahead. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time for another Beyond Biotech.